Hey, Amrita. It's great to have you on the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time today.
Yeah, great to be here, Matthew.
Awesome. Yeah, so you've been a marketing leader for the last 15 years, so you've got a ton of experience. Would love to hear about your journey. Why don't you just walk us through how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Well, I am one of these marketers who's always been in marketing, which isn't always the case. I think you meet a lot of people who came into marketing from other backgrounds, but it was something I was definitely interested in as a teenager, which might sound really weird. I don't know if I knew it was called marketing, but I was exposed to it through a couple of folks that were just, studying marketing or working in marketing. And so I first started out very briefly in consumer packaged goods and then quickly moved into tech around the time of the first internet wave, which was over 20 years ago. So definitely it was a really exciting time. My first startup was actually a company based in Boston. I'm still friends with my first boss. He's like a big deal right now. Well, he always has been, but it's kind of funny thinking back to those early days and essentially worked in B2B startups for most of this time, mostly in the early stage, meaning sort of 0 to 50 million in revenue. That's typically the space that I've worked in, and then moved back to Canada. I've been here for over, I think, 12 years now, working in Toronto for a number of startups. And yeah, I've really loved my journey working in marketing and happy to share a little more. I am at Float, as you know. And so I joined Float about 18 months ago as their head of marketing. My job is to really, build out the marketing function, and marketing at Float really spans, brand, product marketing, revenue marketing. So it's a pretty broad discipline, which I think is also something you see a lot more of now. And we are a company that markets to Canadian businesses, especially finance leaders. And we essentially help them simplify the way that they have to manage all of the spend that is going through that company. It's actually a lot more complicated than you might think until you are in a company trying to buy something, get something expensed, keep track of who is spending what, approvals, all of that stuff. We make life a lot easier for Canadian finance teams.
You've had many leadership roles. You've been the head of marketing, you've been VP marketing, CMO. Are those all the same, or is what you're doing varying based on your title?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think titles can really vary depending on a company. But one of the things that I am seeing is that head of marketing is becoming a much more common title for very early stages of a company where you really want someone to just come in and basically, build 0 to 1. And a lot of times I think companies use head of marketing because they're not ready to introduce a lot of hierarchy in their organization. Sometimes they use that title because they want to hedge their bets and be able to bring in somebody over that person. I think that was more the case maybe earlier in my career where I was younger and more junior. I think now, for example, at Float, that is my title. That was more of a choice around hierarchy. We just want to be a fairly flat organization. And so
Mhm.
all of the leads across every department are called head of or lead of whatever. And then I would say for VP marketing, there is definitely a difference. I know we're going to talk about this as well, but when I have been a VP at companies, typically my job at this point is not so much sort of tactical execution. It's really a lot more people management, strategy, and planning, looking at a longer term horizon. And then I would say CMO, that's also one which I think, different companies give or have those roles established for different reasons. To me, a CMO is someone who's really operating at a level where they are thinking very strategically about the business and contributing even outside of just marketing. But ultimately, I think that they have a team underneath them who are themselves really senior leaders. And I think CMOs are thinking a lot about everything from sort of which markets you want to enter, what your go-to-market strategy is. They're really tied closely to finance as well to make sure that they're sort of profitably, investing in the right areas. But ultimately, to be honest, I think especially in the times we live in, I feel like those titles get interchanged quite a bit, especially VP CMO and then head of marketing VP.
Right.
So it's not really the same. It just depends on which company you're in.
So recently you joined Float, correct me if I'm wrong, about a year and a half ago, fast growing Canadian startup right after they raised a Series A. Does this big injection of cash put more pressure on you from day one, or does it actually make your life easier?
That is a really good question. And I think I didn't feel pressure for that specific reason when I joined Float. I mean, I think there's an implied pressure because you certainly, anytime you work for a venture funded startup, there are certain expectations around what high performance looks like. And so, this is not the first venture backed company I've been at. I think there are different challenges. You certainly want to spend that money really wisely, but it is easier in some ways than companies that have no funding, or maybe you're at a seed stage where there's very little funding. And I think the job of marketing is super hard in those early days. I think I've felt different pressure and maybe more pressure in companies that did not raise any money, because I do think that there are aspects of marketing that can produce immediate returns. And then there's other aspects of marketing that require more medium to long-term expectations. And so if you're joining a really early stage company, you have to be really thoughtful about where you make those investments, because in many cases, you may not be around a year from now. And so I actually think that that is a lot more pressure in a lot of ways. Raising this amount of money, there was no expectation that we needed to spend a certain amount of money. It was really just use this money wisely to make the right bets and help the business hit its growth goals.
So switching gears a little bit, as somebody who currently and has managed middle managers and ICs, what skills and attributes, to you separate those who are ready to be leaders from those who aren't?
I think in marketing, certainly, I do feel like having some domain expertise is really valuable to make that jump to first being a people leader, because you're not just coaching people on sort of soft skills, but often like you are guiding the direction of something, whether it's the content team or the demand gen team. So I do think that people who are ready to move into leadership are showing some kind of mastery of that type of skill. And then I think that there are also people who I think are just really good at either sort of leading before they're designated as a leader. So they're leading in ways like they might be offering like really useful guidance to other people on their team. They might be taking initiative in leading projects. I think ultimately they're showing a lot of accountability, that they can get certain things done, they can move the needle. And so to me, those are all sort of ingredients that someone is ready. And otherwise, I think, again, in some companies, I feel like it's not even that well thought out. I think it's important to put some guidelines or expectations in place so that people understand what it means to sort of move from one to the other. But if I'm being honest, in a lot of cases, it was sort of happenstance. It was, I was at a company, we had a certain number of people, we were growing, we decided to just do more of what we were doing. And depending on how important that particular area was, we either chose to, invest in building out that team or not. And so sometimes I think that, again, if somebody has already expressed interest in moving into more of a people leadership role, I think there's a lot of things that you can give that person as a manager to kind of test the waters before they've even been given that title. And I think, I don't know who said this, but I think there is sort of this like great advice, which is like, do the job that you want to do. Don't wait to be, asked to do it. And so I think you often see people who just naturally are demonstrating that interest and that proactiveness.
And just diving deeper a bit on the first thing you said about domain expertise, for people who are marketing generalists like myself, and I'm sure a lot of people who would be listening, what kind of things would you recommend? Are they just kind of focusing on getting a little bit better at everything, or should they pick their niche and then use that to propel them to the next step?
Yeah, so I was technically like a demand gen marketer, but I was a generalist for quite a bit of the early part of my career. And I actually don't know that that was the best approach. Like, I actually do think there's a lot of value in building expertise in an area. I think there's pros and cons of either. So if I were, again, starting my career today, I think I would pick a lane, because there are some pretty established areas of marketing. So there's content marketing and product marketing and brand marketing. And number one, I think you should pick something that you're really good at. you hopefully really love it as well, but you need to be really good at it. And then I think everybody gets to that point in marketing where moving from being an individual contributor to eventually sort of moving into more leadership roles, you end up having to manage areas of marketing that may not be your area of expertise. And so I would say that, it's still important to understand how different functions work within marketing and certainly be able to identify, what those areas are, what makes somebody really great in that area. A lot of it is also, though, just learning on the job. If
Mhm.
I'm being honest, again, I didn't know about brand marketing until I was leading a marketing department, and I felt like I just had to learn really fast. But I really think that if you love something, if you're really good at it, pick a lane. I think it makes it a lot easier for you to get brought onto a team, because once someone is past sort of marketer one or two, they are ready to bring in specialists. And so
Yep.
I think it's a lot easier actually to hire someone who's a specialist later on than to hire someone who's a generalist, who I think is probably more suited for a super early stage company.
So talking about strategy for a sec, you've taken on various leadership roles in the last 15 years. Do you have a playbook for the first 90 days? Specifically, what kind of things are you prioritizing when you first go in there? And how are you building relationships across the business?
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely kind of reference that a lot of people use. There's a great book called Your First 90 Days, and I think there's a lot of great advice in that book. I think I have used a lot of those guidelines for many of my jobs, and I think I threw some of that playbook out the window at
Mhm.
Float, which I'm happy to talk about. But at other companies, I think, certainly a lot of the advice is spend a lot of time listening and learning before you sort of jump in to fix things. And I think that there are times where I think that makes sense. And I would say at Float, that was not the only thing that I focused on in my first 30 days. The other thing that is really important, of course, is to develop relationships with other people in the business. And I think that's something that I learned, as I became a manager or a leader. I realized that, like, so much of my ability to be successful is dependent on relationships with my sales counterpart or my product counterpart. And so I think it's really important to build those relationships. And a lot of that actually doesn't even happen in the first 90 days. More and more, it's actually starting to happen in the interview process. So, one of the things that more and more companies are doing, especially if you're in, a leadership role, is they want to make sure that you sort of align in terms of values, that there is some sort of commonality in terms of, how you might think about approaching the business. And so I would say that, definitely make sure that you can, develop those relationships as you're coming into a company, and then certainly, in your first 90 days. So that's really important. Obviously, I think a lot of it is about getting to know your team. They're probably pretty anxious about having a new leader if there is a team there already. And if there isn't a team, it's about making sure that you are thinking a lot about what that team should look like, and probably doing some work right out of the gate in terms of thinking about building out your org plan as well. Sometimes that happens again in the interview process, but often it can happen also in your first 90 days. And then there's probably some other things that aren't coming top of mind. At Float, I would say the one thing that was really different was that we are so focused on moving fast and on execution. And so I did a lot more execution in my first 30 days at Float than anywhere else I've been. I started our first big brand campaign. I turned on some of our first demand gen programs, working with contractors. And that was because I just knew that this was the value that was really important to the company. And so I think that kind of goes against some of the advice that you hear around, like, don't do anything for 30 days. I think Float is a place where we love it when people just get started, even in week one.
I guess, a really big takeaway I just got from that, something you said right at the end, is no matter which level you're at, you need to be able to actually do the execution. And, you can't just be somebody who strictly wants other people to do it, because you never know in which situation you'll need to be that person, actually get the stuff done.
I think it's more just dependent on the stage of the company, because I
Mm-hmm.
do think, like, that book is really great. And I think a lot of it applies to, it works like really well for like more established companies. I think very early stage startups are just a bit of a unique beast because the time horizon is so different.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that there's anything wrong with not doing any execution. I also think, for a lot of leadership roles, like my last role, for example, I had a pretty large team. I was running a few different departments. And so I and it was a different pace of business. So I did not do any execution in my first 30 days other
Right.
than maybe like helping out with one sort of specific project. My job was really different than joining an early stage company like Float, where my job was to build. And there was an assumption that part of that would include doing some execution.
What would you say is, the leaders that you're working with, how would you say that influences your job as a marketing leader? What kind of things are you maybe looking for from them? And yeah.
Do you mean like other leaders across the
Yeah,
company?
so like the CEO, the sales leader, product, tech, all those.
Yeah, I think, I mean, with the CEO, the number one thing is just alignment, making sure that number one, their understanding of what marketing is and what will be sort of focus areas to arrive at our business goals, that we're
Mhm.
thinking the same about that. And a lot of times that requires a lot of conversation because marketing looks different everywhere. Not every CEO has the same type of understanding of marketing. It really depends on their background. And so that was another thing that I learned, is that when things don't work out, often it's because of a misalignment. And
Right.
so, that was an important conversation that I've had to have prior to joining companies to make sure we're thinking sort of similarly, and that I'm kind of setting myself up for success instead of not communicating. So definitely over communicating. And then similarly, I think marketing looks so different in every company that as you come into an organization or as you're interviewing, talk to your other leaders about, for sales, for example, like how do they think about things like marketing ops or revenue ops? How do they think about the funnel, the handoff period, inbound versus outbound? There's a lot of those types of conversations that would be really important to have.
Mhm.
And I think that sales in particular, especially if you're in a sales-led organization or a sales-led model, it can make marketing's job like much better or much worse. So I think it's important to figure that out. And then likewise, I think marketing does touch many different parts of the business. And so establishing a lot of that understanding and sort of just like relationship building up front will really pay off in the long run.
I want to discuss challenges super quick. Are there common traps that marketing leaders fall into? And if so, how do you avoid those traps?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I've definitely fallen into some of those when I think about, my own journey. I
Yeah.
think one big trap is under communicating with your people leader, whether it, if you're reporting into the CEO, which, many marketing leaders are. I think just making sure that you're both really aligned on like, what is the job of marketing? Like for some leaders, they think marketing is, you know, generating leads through content. For other people, it might be, going viral on social media. There might be like really unrealistic
Mhm.
expectations. And so I think like that's probably a common trap that people fall under, that they
Right.
don't sort of communicate upfront and agree on sort of measurement and areas of focus. I think another one, which is a common trap, is also thinking that like other companies' playbooks work for your company. So I think there's a real risk, certainly today, especially with everybody sharing so much, especially on LinkedIn and Twitter, about all the things that they're doing and like all the success that they're having. I think it's very easy to take that tactic and just want to copy and paste it into your company, but it might not actually make sense for you at all. And so I get a lot of advice from everybody, like, outside the company, including about like, oh, you should do this, you should do this. And it's like, yes, but
Mhm.
for our market or our audience, this may or may not be a good idea. So I think that's another common trap that marketing folks fall into. And then the third one is really focusing too much on activity and not on outcomes. So it's less important to say, oh, I'm going to publish 10 blog posts a month, and more important to say, my goal is to increase organic traffic to our site through search, 10% month over month. And in order to do that, we're going to create content for, with this purpose. So I think a lot of times, like, it's so easy to just focus on the things we're doing and not so much sort of the outcomes we're trying to influence.
So you're very experienced in team building. How do you know when it's the right time to scale your team or to make a hire?
I think the most obvious one, there's sort of two things that I look at. One is if you're seeing signs that an investment in a particular area of marketing is worth sort of double clicking into. So one example might be, if you started off testing performance marketing and maybe you have a contractor or a generalist on your team and you're starting to see that like, yes, we can profitably grow by investing in these channels. You may then say, okay, we're now at a point where we're going to triple the money that we spend on paid. And it makes sense to bring in a specialist on, let's say search, maybe another person specifically on paid social, or even like lots of companies then go even channel specific. So they'll have somebody just focusing on, LinkedIn or TikTok or whatever. So I think that's one indication that basically you've proven that this channel or this sort of mix of activities is working, and then you just want to do more of it.
Mhm.
And then I think the other way of thinking about it, which is not scientific, is just where are you really feeling the pains in terms of resourcing and bottlenecks. And so what often happens is, you may have somebody on your team, most likely, who is taking on the role of maybe two or three types of marketers, because again, as an earlier stage company, you might say, okay, I'm going to have one person doing, product marketing and brand marketing because, this person has that skill set. And it may just come to the point where it's like they're just like crying in pain because there's just not enough hours in a day.
I want to talk about CrowdRiff super quick. You were there for 5 years, whereas some other roles were shorter tenure. How do you know when it's time to leave a company, and how do you know when it's time to worth staying? And specifically, I'd like if you could relate it to current times. Budgets are super low, industries are hurting. So if you were in a role today, how would you make that assessment in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a personal decision. And I think earlier in my career, I was really quick to jump because I don't think I had the tools to communicate what I wanted for my career path. And I think, it wasn't just my fault. Like, I do think that there are organizations where your people leaders are better at really providing growth paths for their team. And then there's others where people don't do that, or you're overlooked, or there's a lot of bias. And so I think there have been times in my career, I can think of one role where I was the head of marketing reporting into the CEO. It was a pretty small, like 20-person company. And at that point, that company was not venture backed. They were sort of bootstrapped, and the company didn't want to grow any faster. It was like a nice lifestyle business. And so I felt like I was doing as much as I was going to ever do, and I was not learning anymore. So I think if you're not learning anymore and there is no path to that learning happening in the company, for me personally, that's always been a reason to look elsewhere. I think another thing to look at is, again, like, are the ingredients for success there? So I have been at companies where maybe product innovation stagnates, or you see that you've kind of, you're being overtaken by a competitor, and it's just really unlikely that you're going to turn things around as an organization. That might be another reason to consider leaving. Sometimes you leave because a great person you worked for has left. And if that's a really important relationship, you may choose to follow them. Certainly, there are leaders I've worked for that I would follow. And I've been really lucky to have people on my team who've joined me as I've moved as well. So I think that's another reason. And then if I think about today's environment, the reason why I say it's so personal is it really just depends on what's important to you at the time. I think sometimes we gloss over the fact that for some people, like they need a job, like they're not in a position where they can be without income for a certain period of time. You may have to either support yourself or your family. And so sometimes it's sort of like, okay, there's sort of the risk of the unknown and then sort of the risk of the known. And then I think the other thing that I come back to is like, is your company one that's going to weather the storm? I do think that some companies may run out of money. There's other companies that are growing profitably. So, you don't need to be as worried. Maybe they're in a market that is not as sensitive to, economic slowdowns. There's certain industries that actually thrive when the economy is challenging. So I think you have to look at a combination of environment, your own personal growth path, and then also just like your life priorities to decide whether or not it's worth moving.
Last question here. Generally speaking, what advice would you give to marketing managers or individual contributors who aspire to become department heads in the future?
Yeah, I would say number one, of course, just like be really good at what you do. I think being the best at anything is always a great way to get noticed and recognized. If you choose to not go and be an entrepreneur and assuming you want to stay and work as an employee at a company. I think the other thing is to start to talk to some other people who are a few steps ahead of you to really understand, like, how does the day to day of their job really differ. And one really specific example could be, let's say you're in content marketing. If you are a content marketer, early in your career, you're probably doing a lot of writing or, videography, or, you're sort of like creating content. As you become more of a leader within that subject area, you are often doing content strategy. You're not just thinking about this week or next week. You're maybe getting better at editing. You're getting better at managing freelancers. So I think like there might be ways that you can build those skills. And this is one example I've had with people on my team where I had a great content marketer and we decided to just give her a lot of ownership over managing editorial with other freelancers. And it was a great way for her to practice those skills before we brought those additional resources in-house. So I would say definitely do that. And then the third thing I would say is, really think about your soft skills. So I think we talk a lot about, domain expertise in, LinkedIn or paid marketing or anything like that. And I would say that we often overlook like great written communication skills, great presentation skills, great
Mhm.
listening skills. Those are all really good qualities of people leaders. And so, reading books like Radical Candor, knowing how to receive and give feedback, learning how to write well. Everybody Writes is a great book by Anne Handley that I recommend. Nancy Duarte wrote a great book on presenting. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can learn those skills. And that's a great way to sort of get yourself ready to move into more of a leadership role.
Cool, cool. Well, Amrita, you're a wealth of knowledge. I appreciate you sharing everything you have, and thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.